So today I'm going to talk about mineral nutrition impacts on beef cattle production. And so one thing to keep in mind about minerals is that they are a crucial element to the body. However, they do make up one of the smallest portions of the body, with the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen making up about 96% of those elements, and only 3.5% are those elements that we typically discuss when supplementing trace minerals as well as a total mineral pack. So as we can see by the pie chart, that 3.5%, and then calcium and phosphorus obviously make up the majority of that, being part of our bone formation. Then sulfur, sodium chloride, and magnesium, another 25%, and then our trace elements, or our micro minerals, are less than 0.3% of the total mineral content of the body. However, they tend to be some of the most crucial elements. So from our chart here, we can see that the minerals have several interactions around this wheel, and more are being actually discovered today. But it is important to keep in mind our microminerals, our zinc, manganese, copper, cobalt, selenium are typical in our supplements that we tend to think about for our mineral packs, as well as in our macrominerals, such as phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and chloride, or salt. And other ones that we tend to think about are calcium and phosphorus, and magnesium and iodine. Those are somewhat dependent on the mineral you choose. We have 12-12, 20-12, 12-8, just depending on the type of scenario you're in for feeding. And then we think more on the iodine because it's part of iodized salt, which is even what we consume. And then we have magnesium, which we consider more in the springtime for grass tetany issues. Our three main antagonists to at least our microminerals are molybdenum, sulfur, and iron. Iron we typically don't see in our mineral supplements because it is in such high concentrations in our other feedstuffs. Sulfur and molybdenum play a huge role based on soil concentrations wherever you live, or especially with sulfur in the water. So minerals have four main functions: structural, physiological, catalytic, and then hormonal or regulatory. So we'll walk through each one of those. So structural, obviously, bone formation; physiological, such as our sodium chloride with our water balance, nerve excitement; catalytic, DNA and RNA formation, hemoglobin carrying oxygen in the blood; and then hormonal or regulatory, like thyroid hormones and insulin. So to go in more detail for structural, our most obvious function then is our bone, which is calcium and phosphorus, which form hydroxyapatite into a protein matrix that basically is our bone formation. Then we have magnesium, fluoride, and silicon, which is also in bone, but also our teeth formation. Then more on the poultry side, calcium and phosphorus in eggshells, and phosphorus and sulfur in muscle proteins, and then zinc and phosphorus for molecular and membrane structure. Physiological functions, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus once again, sodium, potassium, and chloride as electrolytes in the body, acid-base water balance, pressure regulation, membrane permeability, and then the excitability of our muscles and nerves, so being able to walk and move, and fight or flight responses. Calcium also plays a large role in blood clotting. Catalytic functions include function of phosphorus in bone, as well as metabolic reactions involving energy transfer, phosphorus as well in DNA and RNA, and several others, such as sulfur, manganese, zinc, iron, nickel, chromium, are components of RNA as well. And then minerals for enzymes and other active compounds, such as selenium with glutathione peroxidase, or an antioxidant. And then cobalt is especially important for our B vitamin formation, especially in the rumen of cows. It plays a large role. So those blue lick blocks are typically cobalt blocks, and that helps with our B vitamin formation in the rumen. And then hormonal or regulatory, so iodine and thyroid hormones, which are typically for hunger. Zinc and sulfur are components of our insulin. Calcium for signal transduction, zinc for transcription of RNA and DNA, and several others. So we'll move into our macro requirements, our macrominerals, such as calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. The ones we don't typically think about in supplements are sulfur. The others just depend on the year and depend on the concentration we have in the mineral we choose. Now, if you will notice on both the macro and micro mineral requirements, we do not have a bull requirement. So we typically look at this growing and finishing cattle requirement for our bulls. And probably the two that vary the widest are the calcium and phosphorus, just depending on what mineral you choose. And then magnesium in higher concentrations is only typically included in those high mag minerals in the springtime. So once again, calcium and phosphorus are the main constituents of bone, and calcium also functions as in muscle function, and phosphorus is part of major metabolic functions such as carbohydrate, protein, or fat metabolism. The optimal ratio that we discuss is 1.5 to 2 to 1. Typically, we look at 2 to 1 as our optimal ratio. And performance, really, we don't see reduced until you get a ratio greater than 6 to 1. And another thing to keep in mind is that calcium is generally adequate in our forages, and phosphorus is in greater concentrations in our cereal grains and our concentrates. So deficiencies, as we see, it's just the reverse of our previous slide. Calcium deficiency is more likely in concentrate diets, and phosphorus deficiency is more likely in a forage-based diet. And so once that ratio of calcium to phosphorus exceeds 10 to 1, you know, it's pretty similar among all of our deficiency toxicities. We see reduced growth rates, reduced feed efficiency, reduced dry matter intake, and reduced reproduction. One of the main things you can see is that it also results in severe bone or wood chewing. They're trying to get that phosphorus component back into an optimal ratio. And then if we have a lower ratio of calcium to phosphorus, closer to 1 to 1, once again we see reduced feed intake, but this is in our concentrate-based diets where we typically will see what's known as water belly, which is caused by urinary calculi, which are crystals that form in the steer's urethra and can form crystals in there, and it basically doesn't allow them to urinate, so everything kind of backs up into the belly. Severe results in reduced growth, feed efficiency, and reproduction, similar to our excessive ratio as well. So some things you can feed for both calcium and phosphorus. There's animal byproducts that are, if you need more calcium, such as fish meal, meat and bone meal, etc. Or other additives such as calcium carbonate, dicalcium phosphate, limestone, and then if you need to add more phosphate in without the calcium, they have sodium phosphate as well. The two most common are dicalcium phosphate and the limestone. Moving on to iron, we typically don't see a toxicity or a deficiency. However, and if you do have chronic blood loss for some reason, this could cause an iron deficiency. There are a couple different things causing iron deficiency, and one in sheep and cause anemia, gastrointestinal hemorrhaging, and then the trypanosoma congolens in cattle reduces hemoglobin. Basically, it causes reduction in ferric ions, and so you need to add that iron supplementation in there, or selective feedstuffs that are higher in iron. Once again, toxicity is not usually a problem. Most are fairly tolerant, and we typically see excessive amounts of iron in our feedstuffs, water sources, and things like that. However, it has been shown that iron concentrations in the 300 to 600 part per million range reduce plasma and liver copper, so that's where that tie-in to an antagonist can be, and especially in copper. And this was seen in lambs. However, it can occur in cattle as well. So potassium is one mineral that we don't typically see a reserve in beef cattle in the body. So they need a daily supplement of potassium. However, our forages are typically adequate in that. It does become more prominent in high concentrate diets where additional supplementation may be needed. And one thing to keep in mind is if those animals are stressed by heat or right after calving during that high milk production time, they may need to have an additional potassium supplement in there as well. And then as forages mature, we do see a decrease in all of our mineral concentrations, but especially our potassium. And so if you're feeding old hay or hay that's been rained on, then you may need to think about an additional potassium supplement again. So other potassium sources, cool season grasses tend to have a higher potassium than warm season grasses. And one thing to keep in mind though, cool seasons and legumes can be very high in potassium, which can then cause an issue with our magnesium absorption and basically bringing about a grass tetany situation. Energy sources or grains and concentrates are typically lower in potassiums, but protein sources are relatively high. Other byproducts such as molasses or molasses-based products typically have higher amounts of potassium in them. So those lick tubs or lick blocks out there that have a molasses content to them to promote intake, the potassium is within that portion. Now we talked a little bit about potassium causing grass tetany, but this is typically what we think about with magnesium deficiency in the springtime, as grasses are rapidly growing and are not able to efficiently uptake magnesium from the soil, causing then the magnesium deficiency within the animal. So it can also be caused by grazing ruminants and calves that are the calves that are consuming too long on milk without access to any other feeds. Like I said, the spring calving cows, as well as those older ruminants and livestock that just can't mobilize that skeletal magnesium anymore as efficiently as they could when they were younger with that increasing age. And then one thing to keep in mind is if you abruptly change the diet from a good green grass to a deficient magnesium diet, such as maybe some stockpiled forage or some hay that may have been sitting around for a while, this could also bring about some grass tetany or hypomagnesia, magnesemia, excuse me. So similar to that potassium, it's the we call that more winter tetany because those mature forages and that lower magnesium, and so you're supplementing lower potassium, and you're supplementing extra potassium, which may tie up that magnesium and not allow it to be mobilized and absorbed. Your grass and cereal grain hays are typically lower in magnesium and higher in potassium, causing that winter tetany. And then, as well as this low calcium concentrations, which, especially in those older animals, they are not able to mobilize both that calcium and the magnesium from those bones to help make up for those concentrations that have been lowered. Magnesium oxide is our typical source of supplement for those high mag minerals. However, it is not very palatable, so having that as a source all by itself, the cattle are typically not going to consume that mineral. So mixing it in with your other mineral or if it's in a molasses lick tub of some sort can really help increase that intake. Sodium chloride or salts is important for maintaining pH, osmolarity, and cellular volume within the body. It also promotes water intake. But one thing to keep in mind, you don't want to promote water intake of a poor water source with excessive salt. So if you do notice poor water intake and you're feeding some salt, you may want to check your water and ensure that there isn't any total dissolved solids or sulfate in there that may be turning those cattle away, because if you promote water intake of a poor water source, then that can lead to additional issues. Really, salt should not exceed 8% in the diet. That typically means they will start limiting intake at that point. However, interesting research just coming out of MSU here with Tim Del Curto's lab is that salt typically doesn't control intake how we think it does as a intake regulator. Sometimes you will see an increased intake, and then they may not consume that feed or that mineral for the next few days while they come back and regulate that salt portion. And then they'll come back again and consume quite a bit. So on an average, they maintain a steady intake over a long period of time. It just may be in 2 to 3 day spurts for some animals. Sulfur, one of those minerals we typically don't think about in supplements, because we can get it in both our forages and our other feeds, as well as byproducts, and then in water. But insulin is important for containing disulfide bonds within our polypeptide chains or our protein chains, as well as for oxytocin formation, biotin, and our thiamines such as B vitamins, as well as our amino acids. So sulfur toxicity typically comes in the form of cytochrome C oxidase, and it sorry about that, binds the hemoglobin, which reduces its ability to carry oxygen. So it also causes what we know as thiomolybdates, which is a formation between sulfur, molybdenum, and copper. And that's where we come in with, we typically don't see a sulfur toxicity. It's causing those other issues such as copper deficiencies, as well as a selenium deficiency, because it does interfere with selenium metabolism. So additional with sulfur toxicity, we see increased sulfide in the rumen, and that can lead to what is known as PEM, or polioencephalomalacia, or blind staggers, which is involving the central nervous system. And we see the typical dullness, blindness, muscle tremors, seizures, circling, head pressing, convulsions. Animals will appear as if they were blind. And severe cases, if they have severe intake of sulfur, they can collapse within 12 to 72 hours. And as well as the sulfite may destroy thiamine within the rumen, not allowing those B vitamins to be absorbed. So typically the basis is to remove the sulfate source from the cattle to allow that sulfur to now regulate and allow those B vitamins then to continue to be formed and absorbed, and that will help. However, sometimes additional treatment is needed, and that's best to contact your veterinarian on how that needs to occur. Sulfur sources kind of coming from everywhere. Cereal grains are typically low in sulfur, and oil seeds are relatively high. We do show here that corn is relatively low in sulfur, but byproducts such as distillers grains, we've basically increased this to about 0.4%, which is at the maximum tolerable concentration. It can be in molasses, and it's relatively high. Forages and water are both variable sources. So macrominerals in general, calcium is typically low in concentrates and phosphorus is low in forages. We want a ratio of about 2 to 1. Iron, we don't worry about supplementing iron, but we do need to be aware of our effects on trace minerals in those excessive iron areas. Potassium is decreased in mature forages, and no significant reserves are stored in the body. We typically think of extra magnesium supplementation during the spring, but we do need to keep an eye on our potassium levels in the fall, which may cause winter tetany. And then we look at sulfur toxicity for the PEM and thiomolybdates. So if we look at trace mineral requirements, which are required on a part per million basis, so much less than our macrominerals, which are on a percentage basis, we have several, chromium and molybdenum being the two that we typically don't supplement, especially with chromium, the requirements have not actually been established. Molybdenum just has a maximum tolerable concentration, and then the rest actually don't vary that widely between growing and finishing cattle, gestating and early lactation cattle. Once again, noting that there are no actual bull requirements, and we default to our growing and finishing cattle requirements. So this is our soil survey data for copper concentrations throughout the state. So we can see that the majority of them do actually have adequate copper supplies of that 10 parts per million required for beef cattle. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that copper requirement is influenced by several other factors such as sulfur, iron, molybdenum, zinc, lead, cadmium, and as well as protein sources. So the molybdenum is our biggest concern, especially from a soil standpoint, and we do look at an optimum copper to molybdenum ratio of 2:1 to 4:1. And our normal copper forage levels are between 6 and 16 parts per million and can vary widely depending where you are in the state, as well as how mature those forages are. And one thing to keep in mind, if you are a beef producer that has sheep, do not allow your sheep to consume a beef cattle mineral because the copper can be too high in concentrations and you will have copper toxicity and potentially death in those sheep. Copper deficiency is more what we see, except and that is with, reproductive failure. In livestock, it can also cause anemia, hemorrhaging, red blood cell defects, and some of what we have seen, especially in more of a feedlot type situation, is the development of connective tissue, such as knees and the hocks and everything. That copper is very important for those connective tissue development, and so a deficiency in that area can cause mobility problems in those feedlot cattle, and then as well as connective tissue for early embryonic development. The typical signs are a faded hair coat, those brittle bones, reduced immunity, and severe diarrhea. And we can see deficiency occur when that forage molybdenum exceeds 3 parts per million copper, and then our copper is deficient at being below 5 parts per million. So if we look at molybdenum effects on copper, high molybdenum causes copper deficiency, even if copper sometimes is at that adequate level of 10 parts per million. And increased dietary molybdenum causes an increase in molybdenum in the liver and plasma, and that increase in the liver and plasma therefore increases copper in the plasma because it is no longer being able to be absorbed due to those thiomolybdates tying up copper within the rumen. And so it's triggering that liver to increase copper within the blood, therefore decreasing copper reserves in the liver. Molybdenum toxicity occurs, which basically causing that copper deficiency, but also can reduce crude protein uptake in the small intestines and in steers, research has shown, which then can cause those growth problems. However, the toxicity does vary depending on copper, zinc, sulfur, cadmium, and as different concentrations. So more molybdenum can be tolerated if copper and sulfur are also adequate. However, molybdenum toxicity can vary greatly between 6.2 and 1,000 parts per million. However, we do see that usually a typical maximum tolerable concentration of 5 parts per million. So once again, cattle symptoms with that molybdenum toxicity, pretty similar to all the other deficiencies or toxicities, scours, or severe diarrhea, anorexia, anemia, they're going to lose that condition, and then other copper deficiency symptoms. And 5 to 6 parts per million molybdenum can inhibit copper storage as well as produce those molybdenum toxicity symptoms. And depending on our copper concentration, if it's lower, less than 2 parts per million molybdenum can be toxic. Moving on to manganese. Manganese is important for growth and reproduction. As manganese increases, it increases manganese in reproductive tissues and helps with embryonic development, as well as it's involved in skeletal cartilage, similar to our copper in skeletal cartilage and structure. Typical Manganese, if it's deficient, we can see impaired estrus. It's mostly been observed in swine and cattle, but it can play a huge role in our corpus luteum functioning, as well as our embryonic development. Also involved in metabolism of lipid and glucose. It supports our antioxidants such as manganese superoxide dismutase, which is more in the heart. And it's involved in the biosynthesis of choline, which is another important vitamin. So deficiency, main effects are impaired growth, skeletal abnormalities, depressed reproductive function. Due to that superoxide dismutase in the heart, we can see ataxia in newborn calves, and then defects in lipid and carbohydrate metabolism or glucose metabolism. The deficiency is less likely than for like cobalt, copper, iodine, selenium, and zinc, because most of our feeds that we do provide here in Montana, from our forages to our grains and silages, are typically adequate in manganese. However, we can see some deficiency in our grazing livestock, especially as those forages mature. Now, selenium is another, I would say like a big trace mineral where we can see definite toxicity to deficiency levels here in Montana, just depending on where you are located. As we can see here in the southwest corner, we have typically deficient areas here in these lighter blue. And then as we move to the west, or excuse me, the east into the north central part, we can actually see very, very high levels of selenium. So selenium, we typically think of works with our vitamin E for antioxidant formation. There is, however, a very narrow tolerance range for selenium. And according to the law, no prepared complete feed can contain more than 0.3 part per million selenium. And if we think back to our requirements table that we showed, the requirement for selenium is 0.1 parts per million, so not very much is needed. Mineral supplements can contain up to 120 parts per million selenium, but that total intake shouldn't exceed 3 milligrams of selenium per head per day. So the source of selenium can influence how tolerant they are to that selenium concentration. Organic selenium has a greater impact on that liver and small intestine because it's more bioavailable. Selenium toxicity, it can actually present itself very similar to a copper deficiency with blind staggers. The typical, though, symptoms that we see for selenium is this sloughing of hooves and hair, as well as those severe birth defects in those newborn calves. So selenium deficiency, white muscle disease is the main one we decide. The weakness, stiffness, muscle degeneration, those calves that are born with a white muscle disease or develop it, those knees aren't going to be fully deformed. They're going to have trouble walking, and they're going to have trouble moving that head around. And you may actually see the head in the back position towards the tail of the animal because those neck muscles haven't developed properly to keep that head extended. We will also see this tongue function. They aren't going to be able to suck very well on those teats. And so that's going to be a huge issue for those selenium deficiencies, as well as we will see some increase in retained placentas if selenium is deficient. So last but not least is zinc. One of our immune response or enzymes, enzymatic trace minerals, as well as for hoof formation and structure, as well as reproduction. However, it plays a huge role in our DNA and RNA replication and protein production. We do, however, see that our forages, grains, and proteins are all good sources of zinc, and it is supplied in most of our trace mineral supplements. However, we will see some good zinc concentrations in those other feed ingredients. We just worry in those as the forages mature later in the year, as all trace minerals in those forages start to decrease because that leaf material has matured and may be gone. Deficiency symptoms, excessive salivation, rough hair coat, hair loss, mouth and nose lesions. So to kind of give our big three here that I think of in trace minerals, especially on the reproductive side of things, copper, zinc, and manganese. So in the female, which has been studied much more than the male, we can see delayed estrus, early embryonic loss, delayed puberty, reduced conception rates, increased abortions. On the male side of things, decreased spermatogenesis or an increase of abnormal sperm, delayed puberty, once again, decreased libido. So those are kind of the big three when we think of reproduction and what those deficiencies can cause on a reproductive side of things. So one thing to keep in mind is if you do see an increase in opens in the fall, it may not necessarily be the female. You may also need to consider what you've been feeding your bulls and if they have had access to a mineral supplement as well. However, I will say it is very difficult to make mature animals deficient based on some research I was a part of at Fort Keogh. So you'll need to consult your veterinarian if you are seeing those increased open rates, and may want to consider getting your trace minerals tested. Blood tests can be done. However, for the best trace mineral status, you'll want to collect a liver biopsy, which is a small surgical procedure that your veterinarian can perform and send in. So just the last few slides here, just basic trace mineral supplements. So a few ways to deliver your trace minerals, obviously free choice, or if you include it in a mixed ration, if you're feeding, a mixed ration to your animals. Obviously supplements such as lick tubs, or in the cake. You can also do an injectable source. However, I do like to stress that that is typically 4 trace minerals: selenium, manganese, copper, and zinc. And it is a supplement. It is not an actual end-all be-all trace mineral. Do not remove that other trace mineral source. It just helps give them a nice boost of those trace minerals if you think you're having some deficiency issues. You can also use oral drenches. Like I said before, liver biopsy is the most accurate for those trace minerals. However, a blood sample can be taken because it's easy and it is relatively accurate. However, by the time you typically see a deficiency in the blood, the liver has been deficient for some time, because it will pull everything out of the liver and shuttle into the blood for the use of those biological functions before you will see that deficiency show up in that blood. However, zinc actually is probably the best. The blood sample can actually be used as an indicator for zinc there in a blood sample. So when you're looking at those mineral tags, when you're in the feed store and you aren't sure what to look at, there's a couple different types of minerals. So there's a complete mineral versus a mineral concentrate, and typically if it's a complete mineral, that salt is also included. That mineral concentrate is you're going to need to add that salt to it. And then to look at the sources of those minerals. Are they organic or inorganic sources? So organic are those chelates that have been spoken about. So they're going to be basically attached to like an amino acid. Some will list like an amino acid complex, or they'll be like a copper methionine source. Those inorganics are the sulfates, carbonates, and oxides that you'll see in the list. Typically, minerals, supplements have a mixture of both, because organic sources are actually very expensive, and so they provide a mixture of both to make sure you have increased bioavailability of those organics versus the inorganics. And then another thing to look at is does that mineral that you're looking at fit your feeding environment? So such as a dry lot versus your pasture, or the time of year you're going to be supplementing those minerals. Like we talked about, in the springtime, you're going to want to think about some extra magnesium, and in the fall, you're probably you're going to want to consider a potassium source or a molasses, or one that includes molasses. So like I said, those inorganics are the mineral salts, so phosphate, sulfate, chlorides, oxides. Oxides are typically less bioavailable than these other sources, and like with the magnesium oxide, which is the main source of magnesium included in those high mag minerals, it is less palatable as well, so you need to have that mixed in. Now, organic chelated minerals, like I said, are going to be attached to an amino acid or a polysaccharide or a proteinate. Some will be more specific in the amino acid, and some will just put an amino acid complex because there are several attached. And those are more bioavailable than the inorganic mineral salts. Like I said, most are in combination. But one thing to keep in mind is those total organic chelated minerals are going to be more expensive than your inorganic minerals, so that's why most are in the combination. So some factors affecting mineral uptake, or excuse me, intake. One is the requirements, obviously. Sometimes a year you're going to notice your animals are going to hit that mineral extremely hard. And then other times of year they're not going to touch it. So when the grass is nice, lush, and green, they're probably not going to consume as much mineral. However, I do like to have that out there just in case. And in the fall, they're going to hit it a lot harder because that leaf material has now declined, and they're going to need a supplement more to meet those requirements. Soil fertility, your forage type, like I just said, season of year, energy and protein supplements are going to affect that mineral intake. Water mineral content, palatability, physical form. Are you feeding lick tubs, blocks, or in a loose form? And then one thing to keep in mind is that freshness of minerals. So if you find a bag of mineral that's been sitting in your barn for about 4 years, I would suggest just throwing it away. Most of those minerals are going to be oxidized, and they probably are not even going to be available to the animal, as well as they probably aren't going to want to eat it. And then location and access to that supplement. So an easy access area, if you're feeding like a loose mineral tub, is right by the water source. And one thing I like to make sure to mention is the distribution of those mineral tubs, loose mineral feeders, anything you're feeding mineral in, is making sure you have enough out there so every animal can consume what they need every day. Because those lead cows that are coming in for water, they're going to get what they need, but by the time that trail in cow gets in, she may or may not get a drink of water, and she's probably not, shouldn't say definitely, but she's probably not going to stop and get a lick out of that mineral tub that she needs. So making sure you have an effective distribution for every animal. And that's also one way, especially if you're feeding those, lick tubs or the lick blocks with some molasses in them. If you want to move your animals to a different part of the pasture that they haven't really been at, or haven't hit as hard as some of those other areas, you can move those supplements out there and draw those animals in, and then you can get better pasture use as well. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm only going to supplement during specific times because minerals are expensive, here's a few times. So 30 to 60 days prior to calving, helping because those calves are completely reliant on the cow for their minerals in those first probably 6 weeks of life as they're just consuming the milk. 30 to 60 days prior to breeding to make sure your cows breed up, and that includes your cows, heifers, and your bulls. Don't forget about those bulls out there. We want good spermatogenesis and low abnormal sperm. At weaning time, when those animals are severely stressed, probably one of the most stressful times in a calf's life. And then when you're consuming low quality forages. Now, if you think about all those times that are critical for minerals, I always suggest to always have that mineral available for those animals. It's just an insurance policy that you have on those animals to make sure that they don't become deficient. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and with that I will take any questions.